Late last month, Israel became the first country in the world to recognise Somaliland as an independent state, more than 30 years after the region declared independence from Somalia. At the time, there was hope amongst Somaliland supporters that this would open the door to further recognition by other countries. But a couple of weeks on, this hasn't happened. And if anything, regional opposition to the move seems to have hardened. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at Israel's decision to recognise Somaliland, and what its longer term consequences might be. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. So let's start with a bit of context. We've talked about Somaliland before, but for new viewers, the TLDR is that modern-day Somalia used to be split into two colonial territories, Italian Somaliland in the east and British Somaliland in the northwest. In 1960, British Somaliland became the independent country of Somaliland, to be recognised by 35 other UN members. 5 days later, though, Italy gave up Italian Somaliland, and the two immediately united to become the Somali Republic, which is what we now call Somalia. In retrospect, this was probably a mistake from Somaliland's perspective. Italian Somaliland had a population roughly 3 times that of British Somaliland, and the north was often overlooked by the south. Somaliland got its chance for autonomy in 1991, when Somali dictator Siad Barre was overthrown by anti-government rebels, including the Somali National Movement. The Somali National Movement were a northern paramilitary group, and after ousting Barre, they decided to declare Somaliland's independence, with basically the same borders as the British Protectorate of Somaliland. In 2001, they held a referendum on independence, which was supported by 97% of Somaliland citizens. Since then, Somaliland has essentially been an autonomous state. They've held multiple peaceful elections, and in 2017, Freedom House ranked Somaliland as the only free country in East Africa. The country is very poor, but they've got their own government, currency, passports, police force, license plates, and even a consulate in Washington. Despite all this, Somaliland hasn't been recognised by any other country, largely because most of the international community, and especially nearby African countries, worry that recognising Somaliland would encourage other separatist movements. That was until late last month, when Israel suddenly announced that they would be recognising Somaliland, becoming the first country to do so. So, why did Israel decide to recognise Somaliland? Well, advocates of Somaliland's statehood have long argued that Somaliland deserves international recognition, both because, well, it's functionally an independent state already, but also because the lack of international recognition has hindered Somaliland's development, by making it harder to trade and denying Somaliland access to international aid. But for Israel specifically, there were at least 3 additional motivations. First, Somaliland has offered itself up as a potential refuge for displaced Palestinians. Last year, for instance, Somaliland's president was quoted as saying, "We are a hospitable people. The Palestinians are our brothers. If they decide to come on their own, we don't mind." And the deputy director of Somaliland's refugee department told The Guardian, quote, "Palestinians have been moving here for a long time. Somaliland welcomes all refugees." There has thus been some speculation that Israel's recognition of Somaliland is part of a wider plan to expel Palestinians from Gaza, an idea that has been floated on numerous occasions by Israeli right-wingers, despite the fact it would probably amount to ethnic cleansing. Second, there have been reports that Israel is planning to build a military base in Somaliland, which would help Israel project power against the Houthis, who are based just across the Gulf of Aden in western Yemen. Third, Israel hoped to re-energise the Abraham Accords. For context, the Abraham Accords are a series of normalisation agreements between Israel and its neighbours. They were first conceived by the Trump administration late in his first term, with the first agreement coming between Israel and the UAE in August 2020, making the UAE the third Arab country to normalise relations with Israel after Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994. And further normalisation agreements with Bahrain, Sudan and Morocco coming later that year. The Accords were essentially about integrating Israel into the wider Middle East region via a series of bilateral agreements, allowing Israel to normalise relations without meaningfully addressing the question of Palestinian statehood, which has long been a big sticking point in Israel-Arab relations, and would probably complicate any wider multilateral agreement. Unsurprisingly, the Accords stalled after October the 7th and Israel's war in Gaza, which has reignited regional tensions over the Palestinian issue. Since Trump's so-called peace deal in Gaza, however, both the US and Israel have been trying to revive the accords. No more Arab countries seem willing to sign on, so Israel has instead started turning to non-Arab countries in an attempt to bring political attention back to the accords. In November, for instance, Israel brought Kazakhstan into the accords, despite the fact that Kazakhstan already had diplomatic relations with Israel, and now Somaliland has been brought in. A couple of weeks on, however, and this gambit looks to have backfired. After massive international backlash, Somaliland denied any formal agreement to either the resettlement of Palestinians or an Israeli base. Furthermore, recognising Somaliland seems to have actually undermined the Abraham Accords, rather than re-energised them. This is in part because bringing non-Arab countries like Kazakhstan and internationally unrecognised countries like Somaliland into the Accords has, in some sense, cheapened them. After all, the Accords were supposed to be specifically about normalising relations with Arab countries that had historically been Israel's enemies, and now they're just for basically anyone who wants to signal their support for Israel. But it's also because, in recognising Somaliland, Israel has aligned itself with the UAE, which is one of the few countries to have unofficial relations with Somaliland. In this sense, Israel has sort of picked a side in the escalating intra-Arab rift between the UAE and the other Arab countries, led by Saudi Arabia, which has tacitly criticised the UAE for being too pro-Israel and for supporting separatist movements in Sudan, Yemen and now Somalia, which the Saudis see as undermining regional stability. This has actually hurt Israel's relations with most of its Arab neighbours, and Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, Iran, Iraq and Qatar have all now come out against the move. Similarly, this looks like it might have backfired for Somaliland. Somaliland's government was probably hoping that Israel's recognition would finally break the international taboo and open the door to recognition by other countries. There were even reports that the UAE and a couple of other countries, like Ethiopia and Kenya, were considering following in Israel's footsteps, and even that the UAE was offering cash to countries that recognise Somaliland. But a couple of weeks later, and none of this has materialised. Rather, the African Union has come out to condemn the move in, quote, the strongest terms, demanding Israel reverse it. Maybe it's too early to say for sure, but this is tentative evidence that, in doing what many of its neighbours will consider a dodgy deal with Israel, which isn't particularly popular in the region, Somaliland has actually put other countries off. If you're interested in this, in the latest issue of our magazine, we discuss every major election that happened in 2025, running through races in Poland, Australia, Canada, Singapore, Germany, Japan, Norway, South Korea, the Netherlands, Argentina, Bolivia, Cameroon, Czechia and Jamaica, helping you to catch up on stories you might have missed, as well as understanding the trends taking place around the world. There's so much more in this issue too. In addition to our cover story about the new Middle East, there's also full sections dedicated to UK, EU and global news. The EU section includes our interview with fellow creator Money and Macro, where we discuss how to fix the European economy, Macron's fall from grace, and how Albania has implemented an AI minister. The global section discusses why Trump's mandate isn't quite what it seems, how politicians conquered social media, plus our election summary I just mentioned. And our UK section runs through the rise of the new left, why this year's elections are critical at all levels, as well as the strategies Starmer ought to take to maintain power, and Farage to gain power. Subscribers to Too Long automatically get 20% off every copy as long as they stay subscribed. But as a special New Year offer, you can get an additional 30% off your first issue if you use the code at checkout.